They all thought I'd lost my mind when I agreed to stand beside her at the altar. Guests filled the rows in soft blue and cream, the kind of colors you choose when you want a wedding to feel gentle even when it isn't one. My husband, Daniel Bennett, stood at the front in a suit he'd worn to our own anniversary dinner 2 years earlier, sweat collecting at his collar even though the room was cool. Beside him stood Savannah Cole, glowing in a dress that wasn't quite white, her hand resting on the curve of her stomach like she was protecting something precious. What none of them knew, what none of them could have guessed by looking at my calm face in the second row, was that I'd been planning this exact moment for 11 months. I smiled through the entire ceremony. And by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a woman ends up sitting quietly at a ceremony honoring her husband's pregnant girlfriend, you have to go back to who Claire Bennett was before any of this happened. Claire was not a woman who made impulsive decisions. She was the one friends called when they needed a calm voice at 2 in the morning, the one who read contracts twice before signing anything, the one who remembered which of her children preferred oatmeal over cereal and which of her husband's coworkers didn't get along. She had built a life around noticing things, quietly, without announcing it. 19 years into her marriage to Daniel, she had a home she'd renovated herself room by room. 2 teenagers named Maddie and Tyler who were nearly grown, and a version of stability she had worked hard to protect. She rarely raised her voice. She almost never needed to. Daniel Bennett, on the other hand, had always cared deeply about how things looked from the outside. He was the husband who greeted neighbors by name, who volunteered to grill at the block party, who made sure the lawn was mowed before anyone important came by. People in their town described him as dependable, the kind of man you'd trust to watch your house while you were away. Claire had loved that about him once, the way he wanted their life to look put together for everyone watching. What she hadn't understood, not for a long time, was how far he was willing to go to protect that image, and how little that image had to do with what was actually happening behind their front door when no one else was looking. The truth arrived the way it often does, sideways and by accident. A package meant for Daniel's office was delivered to their house instead, addressed with a name Claire didn't recognize attached to an address she did. She almost didn't open it. She almost let it sit on the kitchen counter the way unopened mail usually did in their house. But something in her, the same instinct that had once told her to double-check a contract or ask one more question in a meeting, made her look closer. Inside were receipts, an appointment confirmation from a women's health clinic, and a note signed with a name that would come to define the next 11 months of her life. Savannah. Claire did not confront Daniel that night. She sat alone at the kitchen table for nearly 3 hours after the kids had gone to bed, the receipts spread out in front of her like evidence in a case she hadn't yet decided to build. She thought about the 19 years, about the mortgage they'd signed together, about the business Daniel had built that she'd co-invested in early on using money from her own family. She thought about her children upstairs, asleep, unaware that the ground under their family was already cracked. And somewhere in those 3 hours, sitting perfectly still in the quiet of her own kitchen, Claire made a decision that would surprise absolutely everyone who thought they knew her. She would not burn her life down that night. She would wait, and she would watch, and she would learn everything there was to know before she said a single word. In the weeks that followed, Claire did something almost no one expected. Instead of confronting Daniel, instead of packing a bag or calling a lawyer the way her sister would later insist she should have, Claire chose closeness instead of distance. She accepted invitations to dinners where Savannah was present. She asked polite questions about the pregnancy. She complimented a nursery color scheme she had no intention of ever seeing finished. Her sister, Renee, watched all of this unfold with growing frustration, convinced that Claire had simply given up, that grief had made her passive. Friends whispered that she was either in deep denial or too afraid of starting over at her age to fight for herself. None of them knew that every dinner, every polite conversation, every smile Claire offered across the table was giving her something far more valuable than an argument ever could. It was giving her access. While everyone around her assumed she was quietly falling apart, Claire was quietly building a file. She requested copies of financial statements she was legally entitled to as a co-owner of the business she'd helped fund at the very beginning of their marriage. She kept records of conversations, dates, and decisions. The same instinct that once made her double-check contracts now turned toward her own home. She discovered that Daniel had begun moving assets, small amounts at first, then larger ones, into accounts and property that were slowly being restructured under Savannah's name. He believed he was being careful. He believed Claire was too heartbroken, too tired, too busy playing the understanding wife to notice what was happening around her. He had underestimated the one person who had spent 19 years learning to notice everything and say nothing until the moment was right. The ceremony itself had been Daniel's idea, though he would later insist otherwise to anyone who asked. He wanted something official, a blessing of sorts for the baby and for what he called his new chapter, held in front of the same social circle that had watched him build his reputation for over a decade. He needed people to see this as a beginning rather than the end of something else. He asked Claire to attend, expecting her to decline, half hoping she would so he could quietly explain her absence to their friends as her being unable to cope. Instead, Claire agreed without hesitation, and something in her calm response should have worried him far more than it did. He mistook her composure for surrender. He had no idea that by agreeing to stand in that room, Claire wasn't accepting defeat. She was choosing the exact place and moment where she intended to finish what she'd started 11 months earlier. Family and friends who watched Claire in the weeks leading up to the ceremony described her as unusually peaceful, almost unnervingly so. Renee tried one last time to talk her out of attending, warning her that showing up would only make her look weak in front of people who already felt sorry for her. Claire only smiled and told her sister that she understood exactly what she was doing and that she needed her to trust her for just a little longer. She spent those final weeks organizing documents into a single folder, confirming details with a lawyer she had quietly consulted months earlier, and rehearsing, in the privacy of her own bathroom mirror, exactly how calm her voice needed to sound when the moment finally came. She wasn't planning a scene. She was planning a correction, one she intended to deliver with the same steady control she had used to hold her family together for 19 years. The ceremony began exactly the way everyone expected it to. Soft music, a small officiant standing at the front, rows of guests who had watched Daniel and Claire's marriage from a distance for nearly 2 decades now witnessing what many of them assumed was its quiet, dignified end. Daniel stood beside Savannah, his hand resting protectively over hers, occasionally glancing toward Claire in the second row as though checking that she was still behaving the way he needed her to. Claire sat with her hands folded, her expression unreadable, the folder she had prepared resting closed in her lap. To everyone watching, she looked like a woman who had made peace with her circumstances. What they could not see was that peace, for Claire, had never meant acceptance. It had meant patience, sharpened into something far more precise than anger ever could have been. When the officiant asked if anyone present wished to speak, a pause settled over the room that felt longer than it actually was. Daniel's eyes found Claire's, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face, not fear exactly, but the faint recognition of a man realizing too late that he might have missed something important. Claire rose slowly, smoothing her dress, and asked if she could say a few words. Her voice, when it came, was steady in a way that immediately silenced the room, calmer than anyone expected from a woman standing in front of her husband's pregnant girlfriend. She thanked everyone for coming, thanked Daniel for the years they'd shared, and then, without raising her voice even slightly, she opened the folder in her hands and began to speak about the business, the accounts, and the property that had quietly changed ownership over the past several months. What Claire revealed that afternoon was not simply the affair everyone in the room had already suspected for months, whispered about at dinner parties and grocery store run-ins. It was something Daniel had never confessed to anyone, not even to Savannah. Claire explained, calmly and with documentation in hand, that the property Daniel believed he had quietly transferred into Savannah's name was never fully his to give away in the first place. Years earlier, during a period of financial restructuring most people had forgotten about, Claire had ensured her name remained legally tied to key assets, a decision she'd made not out of suspicion but simple caution. Every transfer Daniel believed he'd completed in secret was, in fact, incomplete, incorrectly filed, or outright invalid. He had spent 11 months building a new life on a foundation that was never actually his to build on. The room shifted the moment Claire finished speaking. Guests who had arrived expecting to witness the quiet coronation of a new relationship instead watched Daniel's carefully maintained image collapse in real time. Savannah's expression changed from confusion to something closer to devastation as pieces of information she had never been given suddenly rearranged themselves in front of her. It became clear, in the minutes that followed, that Savannah herself had been misled in ways she hadn't fully understood, told by Daniel that Claire had already agreed to a quiet separation, that the property was entirely his, that there would be no complications waiting for her on the other side of this ceremony. She had built her own version of trust on the same unstable ground Daniel had built his, and watching that ground disappear beneath both of them was its own quiet tragedy playing out in front of a room full of witnesses. In the months that followed, the fallout reached far beyond that single afternoon. The legal complications Claire had carefully documented took time to resolve, but resolve they did, largely in her favor, protecting the assets she had spent 19 years helping to build, and, more importantly, securing stability for Maddie and Tyler through a transition no teenager expects to navigate. Daniel's reputation, the very thing he had spent years cultivating among neighbors and colleagues, unraveled in a town where everyone eventually hears everything. Some people offered Claire quiet apologies for doubting her patience during those 11 strange months. Others simply watched, the way people always do, waiting to see what she would build next. Claire didn't need their apologies. She had never done any of this for an audience. She had done it for the two teenagers upstairs who never knew, until much later, just how carefully their mother had protected them. Claire never raised her voice. Not once. Not during the discovery. Not during the 11 months of quiet preparation. Not even in the ceremony where she finally revealed everything she'd been carrying. She never needed to. She understood something that took the people around her much longer to understand. That composure is not the same as weakness, and that patience, when paired with clarity, can accomplish what anger never could. She simply made sure that when the truth finally came out, it came out entirely on her own terms, in her own voice, in a room full of people who had spent months quietly underestimating her. And now, having heard the whole story, we want to know what you would have done in her place. Would you have had the patience to wait 11 months for the right moment? Or would you have walked away the second you found that first receipt on the kitchen counter? Tell us in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, don't forget to subscribe and like and share. Thanks for watching.